This morning, I want to talk about this topic of being thankful. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a ministerial meeting, and Pastor Art Fleming, I mentioned this in a sermon 2 weeks ago, was there. And he brought up this verse to all of the pastors. And when he read this verse, there was just something about him reading this that just hit my heart. And it has not left since. That's in Philippians chapter 1, verse 3. You can turn there. I would hold your finger there. We're going to be all over that, but we'll come back to verses 3 through 6 throughout this sermon. Philippians chapter 1, verse 3, the Apostle Paul would write to the church, to the gathering of believers. He says these words, "I thank my God upon every remembrance of you." I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. Now, when the Apostle Paul says, "I thank my God upon every time that I remember you," listen, here's what I want us to grasp, because there's a lot of Christians that practice religious things in life that are just religious. They're rote. There's something that you do by memory. There's something that you do out of what you know to be right, but there's no heart behind it. The Apostle Paul isn't saying right here that we just throw out a flippant thanks before God whenever we think of somebody. He's not talking about how if you know to be thankful for somebody before the Lord and you come to give thanks to Him, that you give thanks for someone. And then after you give thanks for them, that's the opening for you to start complaining about all of the bad things about them. He's not talking about a generic thanks. Like, God, thank you for my wife, Stacy, for Billy Bob and little May, for little Johnny and the Easter Bunny. He's not talking about a generic thank you that you might say to Him. When the Apostle Paul writes this, what he's saying is that his thanks was intentional, it was personal, and it was to be consistent. And he didn't wait until somebody did something that was really great for him in order to be thankful. He thanked God simply because these people, no matter who they were, no matter what they had done, these people were a part of his life. And so this should teach us a few things this morning. The first thing is this: I want to talk about being intentional. Every remembrance. For all the kids this morning, look at Pastor Corey. Hey, everybody, I want you to say every on the count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Every. Every single time. Every remembrance. Anytime they came to mind, in every circumstance, every single time he thought about one of these people, he gave thanks for them. I mean, can we even comprehend that? To me, that's just a crazy thought, that anytime that you're thinking about somebody, that you begin to give thanks for them. And think about how frequently people come across your mind. I don't know about you, but they come across my mind all the time. I could be sitting there doing something and somebody that, isn't even like a regular part of my life crosses my mind. Can you imagine if you really put this into practice every single time an individual comes to your mind before you even let your thoughts go any further, that you start with giving thanks for them? Now, there's something that might remind you of a person, and so you start to go down that road, and so then you stop yourself, and before you go down that road, you stop and you say, "You know what, Lord, I give thanks for them. Thank you that you had them in my life." You be intentional, because that kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. It's not just going to be a verse that you read, and because you read it, you're going to start doing it. It's something that you have to be intentional to practice, to train yourself, to be able to think this way, whether it's your family, your friends, or somebody that you haven't seen in a while. And no matter the why they popped into your mind, you train yourself to pause. Just pause. And then you give thanks Thank God for this person in my life. I mean, it's a shift of mindset, making gratitude our first response. 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18, the Apostle Paul would write, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks. This is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." How many Christians struggle with what the will of God for them is? You know how many times I've had people come to me like, "Pastor, I just don't know what the will of God is for my life. What's the will of God for my life?" Well, quit worrying about what the will of God is in some grand picture, and why don't you start focusing on what the will of God is in the little things that are really the big things, like learning to rejoice always and pray without ceasing and giving thanks in everything that happens in your life. It means you have to be intentional in order to do it all the time. I've got to have this at the forefront of my mind whenever I start to think of somebody. And it's more than just a good habit. Being intentional means that you make thankfulness a part of your routine. Maybe every single day when you wake up in the morning, you are thankful and you start with thankfulness. As you drive to work and people cross your mind or what might be going on at work or the people that you're about to encounter, before you start complaining or praying for all the bad things that happen, you begin to thank God for everything that has taken place in all of those people in your life. Being intentional whenever your mind starts to wander. If we will practice thanking God for others, I believe that it will train our hearts to look for the good in people's lives and begin to see them as God sees them. So I think most of the time that's the greatest part of our conflict with each other, is that you don't see people for how God sees them. And if you want to see people for how God sees them, then you need to start thanking God for that person being a part of your life. And listen, this is where people get scared because people have faults, and I don't want to thank God if this person's, got all these faults. But the truth is, thankfulness doesn't ignore faults. It just keeps them in proper perspective. It reminds us that no one is defined by their worst moments. It allows us to extend grace, just as God extends grace toward us. And remember, there's always a bigger picture when it comes to the plan of God. The second aspect of being thankful for others is to make it personal. Like I already stated, it's not just a flippant, "I give thanks for this person," or generic, "God, thank you for who they are. Thank you that you gave me my wife," or whatever. Like here's the truth. Genesis 1:27. God created human beings in his own image, and in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. What's the point? The point is all of us are created in the image of God. Every single person has the potential to be godly. Every single person has the potential to walk out God's will in their life, following after him, no matter who they are. True gratitude is not based upon somebody's performance. So we can't only be thankful for the people that make us happy, the people that are easy to love, or people who are always helpful to us. See, that's the easy way. It's easy to be thankful for the people that you love and do things for you and make you happy in life. We got to learn to be thankful for who they are, most importantly, for whose they are. That they're made in the image of God. That every single person, they may be different than you, but they have unique gifts. And if they're in your life, more than likely they're in your life for a reason. And that they have a special place in your life. I would encourage in that personal thing, the idea behind being personal is that you be specific. When Paul writes this, I imagine that he was being specific about what he had seen in the lives of the Philippians. Sure, he's thankful for those, for the church, for what they'd done for him, and the good things that have taken place in his life through them, but he was also thankful for what he has seen God do inside of each one of them. I was telling my wife last night that I was talking to a guy in our church, and he was sharing with me what God has done in his life and what God's been doing in his life as growing him as a better person, growing him to be a better husband, growing him to be a better father. And I said to her, I want to know, that's one of the greatest things that a pastor can hear. Yes, I love baptizing people, but what means more to me than anything isn't what you do for me, isn't what you do for the church. It's to hear what God is doing inside of you, to see that growth in your faith. And I can thank God that I see people who God is working inside of them and growing them in their relationship with Jesus Christ. And so you have to ask the question in that same manner. What about a person are you truly thankful for? Be specific. There's got to be something that you can find in every single individual. And if you can't, you start asking God to show me that person through your eyes. Be specific. Is it their sense of humor? Is it their kindness? Is it their wisdom? And maybe it's that they feel like they need to share their wisdom with you all the time. But that's them helping you in some way, shape, or form, right? Whenever you get around people that are a part of your life that conflict with your being on the inside, they just rub you raw, like it's quite possible they're there for a reason. And like you should thank God for that person. I thank God that this person's in my life because here's, what they do to help me. And Lord, I just pray that they would continue to grow in your ways and truly be specific for who they are, even if they have flaws. Listen to this. Even if they have flaws, find the good inside of them, being specific about what that is, focus on that, and make your thanks personal. As Proverbs 11:27, the Word of God says, if you search for good, you will find favor. But if you search for evil, it will find you. Now just apply that in this idea of the way that you think about other people. The truth is, if all you're ever focused on is all the things that drive you nuts about the person, you will find evil. You will find things that are wrong. But if you will focus on the things that are good in that person, and you thank God for those good things in that person's life, and your attention begins to just focus on all of those good things, it'll make you not just thankful to God for that person in your life, it'll probably make you thankful to that person. It'll change your attitude toward them, and more than likely, eventually, because you're thankful and it's changed your heart about who this person is, that you will receive favor because of your thankfulness for this person in your life. It'll be good for them, and it will be good for you. It's for you. It helps you to see the good in them more clearly and trains us to focus on the positive aspects. The third thing that he says is to be consistent. Consistent means we do this all the time, in the good and in the bad. We are consistent. I think about like the second song that we sang about, it talks about in the good times or in the bad times, whatever, you are still good. Like we still focus on the goodness of God, whether it's good or whether it's bad. We still focus on the goodness of God, even if people are going through good times or bad times. We are thankful. We are consistently thankful for who they are. Listen to this. In verse 3, he says, I thank my God upon every consistent remembrance of you. Every remembrance of you. What is that word, every? It's consistent. Always. That's consistent. In every. That's consistent. prayer of mine, making requests for you all. That's consistent. With joy for your fellowship in the gospel. From the first day until now. That's consistent. Being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. From the first day that he met these people until years later, the now, when he writes this letter. Every single day, every time he has thought of them, he has been consistent. How many knows that from day one until the day he wrote his letter, there may have been some ups and downs? From day one until he wrote his letter, there may have been some good times and there may have been some bad times. From day one until he wrote his letter, may have been some times where there was attitude amongst the people, amongst each other. But from day one until he wrote his letter, he consistently gave thanks to God for that person. Why can he be so consistent in giving thanks? Paul can be consistent because his consistency is in knowing who God is. See, we want to base our consistency of giving thanks based upon an individual, based upon an individual's actions, based upon an individual's attitudes. But the truth is, Paul could be consistent because his confidence is in knowing who God is. And that God is consistent. In knowing that God and what he knows about God, he doesn't start something that he can't finish. And that a person is still in the works, right? Whatever good work God has begun in a person, we can know that God will complete that work in that person. And sometimes we get caught up in seeing the bad things that are going on in a person's life. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stay consistent in giving thanks for the good things in their life. What comes to my mind is Romans 8:28, which is part of my life scripture. Just knowing and understanding this, not just for my life, but for everybody's life, that God works all things together. All things, that's consistency. The good and the bad. That he'll work all things consistently together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. It doesn't mean that bad things aren't going to happen in that person's life, that they might do bad things, or there'll appear at times that things aren't going the way that you think that they should be going. But I can give thanks for who that person is. Because even though things may not look good right now in their life, God is still doing a work inside of them. I may not be able to trust them, but I can trust God. Because God is good. Because God is faithful. Because God says that he's working inside of us when we receive him into our life. Because God says that he will finish what he started. I can put my confidence in God and continue to be thankful for that person. In the midst of all that person has going on in life, it might just be possible that because we stay thankful for that person, that God uses us in the work that he's doing in that person's life. If you base it off of who they are and what they're doing and you're no longer thankful, guess what? You're to be the light of Christ. You're probably no longer the light of Christ in their life because you become disappointed, because you grow bitter, because you start to have an attitude towards what is taking place. But if you can remain a thankful person for who they are in your life, then it might just be your attitude that helps bring about the change that God is trying to do inside of their lives. To fully grasp what the Apostle Paul is saying right here, you have to understand the Apostle Paul's second mission journey. Now, we're not going to read through all of it this morning because it's a long service and we have a lot going on, but I would have loved to take you through it. I encourage you, read Acts chapter 16. This is his second mission journey. In Acts chapter 16, he explains everything that went on in his life and how the church started in Philippi. It also explains how he got to the place of writing this letter. So to summarize this morning, it started when he left, with God stopping him from going to the places that he thought he was supposed to go to minister. He tried to go to this area, this region, and God said no. So then he tries to go to another region, and God says no. Paul, probably a little bit of frustration, is wondering, God, you sent me out on this mission journey. Where am I going? And eventually, while waiting for the Lord to give him instruction, he has a vision of this man waving him over to a place called Macedonia. A city that he's going to go to doesn't even have enough male Jews in it to have a synagogue. It's a city that's full of ex-soldiers for the Roman Empire and a bunch of Gentiles. Now, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but for a good Jew to go somewhere and go amongst a place that didn't have any other Jews, or the amount of Jews was so few they couldn't even have an actual synagogue. Because what you got to understand is wherever the Jews traveled, if there's at least 10 males, they'll start a synagogue, a church, a gathering for Jewish believers, if they even have 10. This city had none. And then he gets sent amongst the Gentiles, which to a Jew was considered to be a dirty dog. And so here he gets sent to this place that's full of ex-Roman soldiers, that's full of Gentiles in this city. And this is where God says, I want you to start ministering. So who's he going to minister to? Well, what does he do? He goes down by the riverside. And down by the riverside, the only person to listen to him, to listen to his teaching, to listen to his preaching, the only person that would hear what Paul had to say was a woman named Lydia. Now, this just adds to the craziness of this whole idea. Because as you know, in the days of the early church, that women were like second on the lowest rung of the ladder of influence in society. So if you're going to go into a city, you'd think that, you would want to go to the person that has the most influence, or those guys who could influence other people. But instead, God sends them down to the riverside to preach to a bunch of women who are probably getting water out of the river for their families. And one woman out of all of those women decide, you know what? I like what you had to say. I'm giving my life to Jesus, and her whole family get saved. That's a good thing. But from there, what takes place is she says, I want to invite you to my home, and you guys can stay here and do your travels and your ministry from here. And so as they start to walk around the city, after they get invited to stay, then there's a demon-possessed slave girl who was a fortune teller that begins to follow them around and mock them as Christians. And the slave owners were kind of business guys. They'd make money off of her fortune telling until they cast out the demon. And then now she's set free. She's no longer fortune telling. She's no longer doing those things. They can't get any money anymore. But instead, what takes place is the business owners, they threaten Paul and Silas. They gather the city together to turn against them. And in turning against them, they beat them and they get them jailed by the magistrates and they get put in prison. Are things going good or are they going bad? Right? So while they're in prison, then they get put in the back of the prison, and in the back of the prison, they begin to sing songs. Well, God miraculously rescues them, right? And the jail shakes, their shackles fall off, and the jailer, he thinks that he's done for because these guys are all set free, and people are able to leave the jail. And that in that, Paul and Silas recognize what's taken place, and so then they tell the jailer, stop what you're doing. They tell him about Jesus Christ, and he gives his life to Jesus Christ, and him and his family get baptized, and they get saved. Now, from there, it says that Paul and Silas just left. They go on to another city, and they continue to preach the good news and the gospel and share with other believers. But however, behind them, in Philippi, they left a few believers behind. A church. Paul later gets arrested, and in another city, while in jail, he'd write a letter back to that small gathering of believers in Philippi. I want you to understand who he's given thanks to. To the culturally oppressed woman and her family by the river. To the ex-fortune-telling, demon-possessed slave girl. And to the blue-collar jailer and his family. To the saints, he who has begun a good work in you will complete it. To the mixed match of riff-raff that started off as the Dirty Dozen. To the bishops and deacons, because you've obviously grown, he has begun a good work in you, and he will complete it. I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. Meaning, I thank God for closed doors because closed doors led to a riverside. I thank God for anyone who would hear and be receptive no matter who they are, even if you're a woman in that day's society. I thank God for foolish businessmen who let a slave girl follow us around. I thank God for everyone that witnessed our beating so they could witness our freedom. I thank God for the magistrates that falsely judged us and sent us to prison, only to see that God set us free. I thank God for the jailer who shackled our feet, but was miraculously saved. I thank God for the faithfulness of every single person who gathers together now in the city of Philippi, always in every prayer of mine, making requests for you with all joy for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now. Paul is able to give thanks to them with joy, even though he's currently back in prison, because he sees the bigger picture. The goodness and graciousness of God is that God uses broken people in any way and every way to reach other people. And that those people's lives that have received, now they share in the fellowship of the gospel. Now they're a part of the good news story. Now their lives are included in what Jesus Christ can do in a person's life. That's how it should be with all of us. God uses broken people. We may look and see around the church, that person has issues. They rub me wrong. But in the big picture, God uses that person's life to share in the gospel, to be a part of the good news story of what Jesus can do in somebody's life. And maybe God's not finished yet. He's not finished with any of us yet until the day that he returns. To learn to be thankful, when you understand the big picture, it's something to intentionally, personally, and consistently be thankful for. I want to challenge you guys this morning before we go into the fun of the after church stuff, that this week, as you leave this church, it's going to take practice. You're going to have to train your brain. Every time you think of somebody, I don't care if it's somebody that you love dearly or if it's somebody that you dislike dearly, you pause and you give thanks for that person for something good in their life. Now, you probably, when you get started, are going to find yourself 5 minutes into the thought and realize, oh, wow, I've had all these bad thoughts about this person. I haven't even started. Stop. Right then, pause and say, you know what, I'm going to lift this weight right now. And I'm going to give thanks for them. And every time you pause to lift that weight, to give thanks for them, you're lifting it up to the Lord, lifting that person up to the Lord, and something good about that person. It gets lighter, it gets easier, and it'll become a more frequent part of your life. I challenge you, give thanks for everyone in your life in all circumstances. consistently.